Welcome to the Employment Law and HR Podcast with your host, Alison Colley.
Hello and welcome to this episode 179 of the Employment Law and HR Podcast. I'm your host, Alison Colley. I'm an employment solicitor and HR specialist, and I run the firm Real Employment Law Advice, where we provide advice and assistance to both employers and employees. Now, the aim of this podcast, as those of you who are regular listeners will know, is to bring you updates, best practice ideas, case law, and that sort of thing. And this week, unfortunately, you might hear from my voice, I'm actually losing my voice and I've got a severe chest and cold. So I'm bringing you an episode which is actually a presentation I gave to our HR Harbour members, who are business owners and employers, about sickness absence management and some practical tips. So hopefully you find this episode helpful in managing sickness absence. And of course, if you have any questions or you have anything you want to ask, then please don't hesitate to get in touch.
In that case, we've got through the first few bits fairly quickly. We'll move on to talking about an introduction to sickness absence and managing sickness absence. Now, this is just an introduction. I'm not talking about the process of dealing with someone on a formal basis, giving warnings and that sort of thing. And we can cover that if you would like to later on. But for now, we're going to talk about how best to manage sickness absence when it arises. And this is both short-term and long-term absences. So the first thing I would add is that the key here is to managing absence. So the key is in the title. It's managing the sickness absence appropriately. It's really easy to neglect managing absence and to just let things slip or slide. And in my view, having a simple process in place that is communicated to staff and managers is the key to successful sickness absence management. So if you take one thing away from the webinar today, that is that you need to have a process in place to appropriately manage sickness absence. And it doesn't have to be too onerous, as you'll see from what I'm going to talk about now. So the first thing I wanted to consider is, what are the barriers to effective management of absence? And I see this all too often in organisations, that they come to us and ask for advice when things have become, serious. So if someone's had a lot of absence, a lot of frequent absence, or somebody's on long-term sickness and it hasn't been dealt with. And the reasons are often related to these sort of four things. And I'd be interested to hear if anyone else has any things that would cause barriers in your own organisation to effective sickness management. And the first thing is not being clear of the process. So managers or supervisors are not aware of what the sickness absence management process is. So there may be a process that's written down, or there may be something in the staff handbook, but it hasn't actually been communicated to managers and they haven't actually been trained on what the process is. So that's often the reason why people don't manage absence appropriately. The second thing is people are worried about doing something wrong. There can be a fear amongst managers that when somebody's off sick, they're really worried about either getting it wrong and causing them to be unwell for a longer period, or making their sickness absence worse, or even worse, they're worried about having a claim being made against the company. So it's important, again, that managers are empowered by knowing the process and having some training so that they don't have this fear of doing something wrong. The third reason is if you have a hostile or unengaged employee. So sometimes employees have a perception about how they should be treated when they are off sick, and they can then often be hostile or not willing to engage with managers or to communicate appropriately. So that can be one of the barriers. And then finally, one of the things I see is a lack of time. So managers often think, I don't really have the time to dedicate to this. And if somebody's off sick, actually, it's much easier just to leave it and let it go, because, they're not causing any difficulty to me right away. They're not a problem, and it's one less thing I have to worry about. So often it's the lack of time. Does anybody else have anything that they want to add to that? Any reasons why you might not want to manage absence? in the workplace?
I've seen it before, and I think it probably sits in with point 2, that they're worried about doing something wrong. Sometimes the reason the employee's off can sometimes put managers off trying to get in touch with them, because they're again afraid that, one, they might do something wrong, or that they might prolong the absence. But sometimes they know they have to do it, but they just don't want to, given the reason.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was going to say, it's a lack of training, isn't it? That comes within, underneath worried about doing something wrong. And it's also, when employees are off for a long period of time, a lot of employers will say to me, oh, well, we're really worried. Should we be contacting them or not? And it's this fear, isn't it, about, doing something wrong and making things worse. As you say, you're not really understanding how to approach someone's particular illness. Particularly mental illness is extremely hard to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully we'll cover some of that off in a mo. But what I would say is we're always here to help you as HR Harbour members. You have access to us. Just give us a call and we'll be able to give you some reassurance at any point in relation to the process or dealing with an employee who's off sick. The first thing about managing sickness absence is really having this clear reporting process. This is, again, having a process in place is the number one thing, and managing it appropriately. But then following that, you need to make sure that you have a reporting process. I think this is something that most organisations have. So many employees will understand that they need to report their absence, and they do. It's very rare that employees don't actually report their absence. And in my view, that's a whole other issue. But often what's neglected is, one, who it should be reported to and what the method is, what's the most appropriate method of reporting the absence, and then what the frequency of reporting the absence is. So in your own policy, if we've drafted them for you, it should certainly have all of this information, and oftentimes details are included within the employment contract to make it very clear. But it's about reiterating that and making sure staff understand that they need to report their absence, but by what time? What time do you expect them to notify you if they aren't going to be in? Who should they prioritise telling? Obviously, it's not always appropriate that somebody's in or that they're not available to be reported to. So, for example, you might say you have to report your absence to your line manager. Now, their line manager might not be in or might not be available when they call. So you can say, obviously, if they're not available, somebody else, another manager. But you need to make sure they understand that. So they're not just phoning up their mate and saying, can you just tell them I'm not going to be in, sort of thing. And then the method, and you'll see below there, I've put prohibiting reporting by text message and email is really important, in my view, for effective sickness absence management. It's very easy for someone to send a text message or an email and not actually phone up. And whilst not every employee is pulling a fast one, I'm not suggesting that, but actually having somebody telephone in gives you an opportunity to ask them a few more questions. So, are you seeing the doctor? When do you think you're likely to be back? And being able to get more information than you can get from a text message, which may just say, I'm not feeling very well, I'm not going to be in today. So that's one of the reasons why I say, and I strongly recommend, that you set out very clearly to the employee what they can do when they want to report the absence. So that really should be by telephone to an appropriate person. And then the frequency, if they are, for example, going to be off for a couple of days, then it may be that you want them to report in every day. And I think that, again, phoning by telephone when it's a short-term absence like that is something that you can ask for. Of course, you might decide that in an individual case, actually, you don't need to phone us. So if they phone up and say something's wrong, you can say, don't worry about phoning us back. Just let me know if you're going to be back in. But if they haven't got a sick note, then you can ask them to report every day when they're off sick. And then, of course, reminding employees of the process and making sure that they understand it. And then if they fail to follow it. So if somebody does send a text message rather than telephone in, it needs to be followed up with them so that they understand what the process is and a reminder of it. The next thing that you need to consider when managing sickness absence, as Miranda was explaining about earlier on, is about maintaining contact during their absence. So often we're asked a question about this because employers aren't sure if they can make contact with an employee who's off sick. And my advice is that unless the employee is specifically advised by their doctor that they shouldn't have contact with work, then you can and should maintain contact with them. And it's very rare in my experience that a healthcare professional or doctor will say that they shouldn't have any contact at all with work. And that's normally in sort of very extreme circumstances. So you can maintain contact with employees. And what I would say is that you should agree the frequency and method of contact with the employee at the outset. So, for example, if you have an employee who is signed off sick, for example, with stress by their doctor, and they've got a fit note that lasts for a month, then when you receive that fit note, you can say to the employee, I've received it. I'm going to contact you every 2 weeks just for a quick check-in by telephone to make sure that you're okay, so that they understand. And making it clear that it is just a quick informal check-in and it's not a formal review, or you're not going to be chasing them to return to work, but it's just merely maintaining that contact, which will make it much easier for them to return to work and for you to have an understanding about how they are progressing. And then if they are off for a longer period, then I would advise that you have formal catch-ups with them where you discuss their absence in more detail, their treatment and the prognosis. So, for example, if you have an employee who's signed off work for 3 months, then I would suggest having a formal catch-up with them once a month where you're just discussing the absence treatment and what's happening. The informal check-ins are really just about saying, how are you doing? Maybe telling them what's going on at work, how are things with you? Any idea when you're likely to be back? That kind of thing, rather than anything more formal. So don't be afraid to maintain contact. And actually, in my experience, those employers who do maintain contact with staff during their absence have less issues when the employee actually does return to work, because the employee is less afraid of returning to work. They feel more comfortable and more confident to return and have those discussions with their employer. But it's about setting it up right at the very beginning. We are going to have these conversations. I'm going to telephone you for a check-in kind of thing. The next thing is self-certification forms. And I know that many of our Harbour members use the forms that we have produced for you, but I strongly recommend, if you don't use them or you're not insisting on staff using them, that you do start to do so. They should form part of the sickness management process, and all employees should be required to complete the form, regardless of the length of their absence. The reason for this is, if you use the forms in particular that we've produced, there is clear space on there for the employee to provide their information about why they've been off. And also there's a space in there for you as the manager or the employer to write down how long they've been off for and how many days, for example, they've been off in the last 6 or 12 months. So it helps to keep fresh in your mind how many days actually they've had absence, so you can keep a hold of it. And also those forms can help you later on if problems arise. So quite often we will find in a situation where we're advising on perhaps a disability discrimination claim, where an employee is asserting that they have a disability, and that then we look back over their sickness absence forms, and the sickness absence forms say various reasons for the absence that are unrelated to their disability. So it's really important that you have those filled in by the employee and they are kept on their personnel file for review. It should also be used as part of the return to work discussion, which is the next thing I'm going to talk about. And as I say, on the forms that we've produced, there is a space in there for managers and employers to make notes about their return to work process. So that's where I was talking about the return to work meetings. These don't have to be a formal meeting. It can just simply be a check-in with the person when they return. So that is to say, getting their self-certification form and just saying to them, thanks very much. I see that you were off for this reason. Is everything okay? Are you having any treatment? And then just making a note on the form of that. It's a good way of checking in with them. And again, just making sure that you understand a bit more about what's been going on with them, what treatment they're receiving, if they're on medication going forward. And if the absence is for 7 days or more, so they've been required to obtain a fit note, then you should have a more formal return to work meeting with them where you purposely sit down to talk about the reason for their absence, what's happening now, as I say, what medication they might be on, any adjustments that may be needed, and if there are any additional risk assessments that are required for them as individuals. So, for example, if somebody has been signed off work for more than 7 days with, let's say, work-related stress, then it's really important that you undertake a stress risk assessment with them when they return to work, so that you have a full understanding about what may be needed to prevent them from going off work in future. And it's also a good opportunity at those return to work meetings to discuss the frequency of the absence if you've seen a pattern emerging. So that's where the self-certification form really helps, because it requires you to have a look over what their previous absences have been and make a note of it. And at that point you can say, actually, this is becoming something more frequent and a bit of a problem, so we need to look into it in more detail. And that leads nicely on to dealing with frequent absences. And this is where, as I say, just to stress that the good record keeping will help you in identifying any patterns or issues early on. Don't be afraid at those meetings to say if somebody is being off frequently. So like, for example, if you identify they've had 25 days in the last 6 months, you can say, look, I noticed that you've had 25 sick days in the last 6 months, and then continue the conversation about that. It enables you to explore the reasons for it in more detail, and then to decide if you need to go down a more formal route in relation to their absence. Often, one of the things that prevents employers from managing frequent sickness absence in an appropriate way is not understanding at what point they should trigger that process. And that's where having the Bradford scale, for example, could help you as a means for triggering the formal processes. The Bradford scale requires you to carry out a formula in relation to give a score, so the sickness absence versus the frequency, and gives a score. And then you can include within your sickness absence policy a sort of threshold for starting the formal absence process, if you like. And I know several of our Harbour members do have that in their sickness absence policy. And if that's something that you don't use or you'd like to explore, again, you can have a chat with any of us and we'll be happy to help you with that. And then just moving on to some of the points to note in relation to managing sickness absence. It's really important to understand, in my view, that frequent or problems with absence, either with an individual or within your organisation, will be as a result of an underlying issue. And so the key to preventing and reducing sickness absence is actually to get to the root cause of the issue. It's all very well and good saying, okay, we're going to manage our process, we're going to have really clear reporting, we're going to have good record keeping, and we're going to deal with things when they arise. But actually, if you're not really getting to the root cause of why it's happening, it will just keep happening and actually probably get worse. And there can be a variety of root causes for the absence. They can be both personal and work related. It may be health related for the individual. They may have a disability, or it could be that they're just very unhappy at work, or there's something going on internally that you need to look at. So as part of your process of being a really good employer, you need to make sure that you get to that root cause. And that's where I say the steps beforehand, like managing the sickness absence, having those self-certification forms and having those follow-up discussions will help you get to that root cause much quicker. So just to summarise there very quickly about managing sickness absence, the main thing is managing the absence is the critical part of managing sickness absence. You need to identify what the barriers are within your organisation or with yourself to effective sickness absence management, to ensure that everybody is following the same process and really managing it. You need to have a clear sickness absence reporting policy, which most of our Harbour members will have, but it's just revisiting that and making sure that everybody knows what's contained within. Maintain communication during any periods of absence, using the forms, holding the back to work meetings and discussions, and increasing communication and discussion about issues so that you really get to the root cause. And always consider adjustments and flexibility. Of course, if somebody has a disability, then that provides an additional onus on you from a legal perspective to undertake adjustments. But it's still important, regardless of whether someone has a disability, to look at adjustments and flexibility if someone has been unwell, for example, as a result of work. And then finally, just being a great employer. If you take all of these steps, it goes towards being a great employer and preventing problems from arising.
So I hope you found that episode helpful. It's just a quick recap there on how to best manage sickness absence within your workforce to ensure that problems don't arise or to prevent problems from becoming much worse in the long run. As always, my team and I are always here to help you with any questions or queries that you might have in relation to your own business. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. You can email me directly. My email is alison@realemploymentlawsadvice.co.uk. And as I said at the beginning, this podcast was taken as an extract from the monthly webinars that we provide exclusively for our HR Harbour members. If you're interested in finding out more about bringing your business on board as a HR Harbour member and having excellent support to help you be the best employer you can be in your industry, then again, don't hesitate to get in touch for a free, no obligation quote. I hope that you have a fantastic week, and I hope that by the time I come to record the next episode of the podcast, I will have my full strength and voice back.
Thanks again for listening. Just want to finalise by saying I wouldn't be a lawyer unless I had a legal disclaimer. So I must just say to you that the information in this podcast is for information only. It's general review and a general update. It's always necessary to get specific legal advice about your circumstances. So please don't rely on anything that you've heard in this podcast. But please do feel free to contact me if you'd like further information or specific advice.